The first sound you hear is the crack of old timber giving way, a dry snap that echoes across the valley like a rifle shot. And in that moment, you already know this story will not end quietly. Because when a man who has buried friends, seasons, and regrets finally decides to stand his ground, the earth itself seems to lean in to listen. And I want you to stay with me until the last nail falls, because what happened on that land was more than a dispute over boards and boundaries. It was a reckoning, decades in the making. I am 65 years old, and the mountains have carved my face the way rivers carve stone, slow and honest, leaving lines you can't fake and can't erase. My hands are thick with scars, my knuckles swollen from winters that didn't care if I was tired or hurtin'. I wear the same tan Stetson I bought after my wife passed, the brim bent just enough to keep the sun out of my eyes, and a denim shirt whose pearl snaps have seen more dust than most people see in a lifetime. This land has been mine longer than most people in town have been alive, and I don't mean on paper alone. I mean in the way you know a place when you've bled into it, when your sweat has darkened the soil, and your prayers have been swallowed by the wind. The cabin sat there like a lie that had gotten comfortable. It wasn't big, just a squat, smug thing of pine logs and green trim tucked right up against the stand of aspens near the creek. The HOA called it a community resource, a phrase so clean it could scrub the truth right out of a room. They said it was for meetings, for gatherings, for shared harmony. What they never said out loud was that it sat squarely on my land my grandfather fenced with his own hands, land my father defended when developers first sniffed around like coyotes, land I had kept alive when everyone else sold off pieces of their souls for quick checks. I noticed it one morning, the way you notice a bruise you don't remember getting. I was riding the fence line, checking for breaks after a storm, when I saw the fresh lumber gleaming between the trees. At first I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, that my memory had finally gone soft, but then I rode closer and felt that cold, slow anger start to crawl up my spine. There it was, bold as brass, a cabin where no cabin had ever been, its foundation dug into my soil like a parasite that had learned how to smile. The HOA officer came to see me 2 days later, right on schedule, like men who think they're in charge always do. He was in his 50s, hair slipped back, suit pressed so sharp it looked like it could cut you if you leaned too close. His shoes were polished within an inch of their lives, useless for anything but walking carpeted hallways. He introduced himself with a hand that expected to be shaken and eyes that expected obedience. He spoke slowly, carefully, like someone used to explaining rules to people he believed were beneath him. He told me the cabin was necessary, that the community had voted, that paperwork had been filed. He told me I should be proud to host such a thing, that it would increase value, that it was a small sacrifice for the greater good. He never once asked if I agreed. He never once acknowledged the survey markers I'd shown him, the old iron pins my grandfather hammered in when this land was still considered worthless scrub. He smiled the whole time, a thin, tight smile that said he believed the matter was settled. I listened. That's something the years have taught me, that silence can be heavier than shouting if you let it. When he finished, I told him the cabin was on my land and it needed to be moved. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I just stated a fact, the way you might tell a man the sky is blue or the creek runs cold. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. He said surveys could be interpreted, that boundaries evolved, that the HOA had authority. Authority. That word sat between us like a bad smell. After he left, I walked the perimeter of the cabin alone. I pressed my palm to the fresh wood and felt heat from the sun trapped inside it. I thought of my wife, who loved that stand of aspens because they sang in the wind. I thought of my father, who taught me that a man who doesn't defend his ground will lose more than dirt. I thought of all the times I'd bent to keep the peace, and I felt something in me settle, like a rifle settles into your shoulder when you finally line up the shot. They ignored my letters, they dismissed my calls, they posted notices on my gate about access and compliance, bright papers flapping like insults. Neighbors stopped meeting my eye, afraid to be caught in the middle, afraid of the HOA's fines and threats. The officer came back once, this time with a clipboard and a practiced tone, telling me there would be consequences if I interfered with community property. He said it like a challenge, like he wanted me to blink. What he didn't understand was that I had already decided. I wasn't going to argue, I wasn't going to beg, I wasn't going to wait for anyone to save me. This was my land, and if they wanted a fight, they were going to get it the old way, with work and resolve and a willingness to see things through. I started at dawn, the air still cold enough to bite. I parked my tractor near the cabin and shut off the engine, letting the quiet stretch. For a moment I just stood there, hat pulled low, listening to my own breathing. Then I went to work. I didn't smash or rage. I dismantled. I pulled nails, pried boards, cut beams where they needed to be cutting. Each crack and groan a punctuation mark in a sentence I'd been writing my whole life. As the walls came down, memories rose up. I remembered building my own barn with my wife handing me tools, laughing when I dropped a hammer on my foot. I remembered storms that took roofs and fences and how we rebuilt without asking permission from anyone. The cabin resisted in small ways, stubborn joints and hidden fasteners, but nothing built by a committee can stand against a man who knows patience. By midday, the officer arrived, his car skidding to a stop on the dirt. He got out shouting, his suit already dusted, his voice sharp with disbelief. He threatened me with fines, lawsuits, arrests. He waved papers in the air like they were shields. I didn't stop. I didn't even look at him at first. I kept working, sweat darkening my shirt, my muscles burning in a way that felt clean and honest. When I finally turned to face him, I told him he could watch or he could leave, but the cabin was coming down. The look on his face was something I'll never forget, a mix of outrage and fear, because for the first time he realized that his authority ended where my resolve began. He called someone, probably a lawyer or another officer, and paced like a caged animal while I kept pulling the place apart, piece by piece. By evening, the cabin was a pile of lumber and nails, its green trim stacked neatly, its foundation exposed like a wound. I sat on a log and drank water, my hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The officer stood at a distance, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. He left without another word, dust trailing behind his car like a bad omen. The days that followed were heavy with waiting. Notices came, angrier this time. Neighbors whispered. The HOA threatened court, threatened ruin. I slept light, every creak of the house sounding louder than it should. But beneath the fear was a steady calm, the kind that comes when you know you've already crossed the point of no return. When the judge finally ruled, backing my claim, it was almost anticlimactic. The papers said what I always knew, that the land was mine, that the cabin never should have been built there. I didn't cheer, I didn't celebrate, I just folded the decision and put it in a drawer, because the real victory had already happened out there by the aspens, with my hands in the dirt and my heart finally unburdened. The officer melted down when he heard, they said, raised his voice, slammed doors, blamed everyone but himself. I didn't see it, and I didn't need to. Revenge isn't always about watching someone else fall apart. Sometimes it's about standing exactly where you belong, unbowed, and knowing that when you acted, you did it on your own terms. Now, when the wind moves through the aspens, there is nothing blocking their song. The land looks like itself again, scarred but honest.
I ride the fence line in the mornings, the sun warming my back, and I think about how close I came to letting someone else decide what mattered. I'm an old man, sure, but some lessons take a lifetime to learn, and if there's one thing I know now, it's that when you finally choose to defend what's yours, the world has a way of making room for you, one fallen board at a time.
Night didn't bring rest. It brought memories, and they came heavy. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle, every pop of wood sounding like a footstep. The judge's ruling might have been on paper, but paper doesn't erase resentment, and men like that HOA officer don't forget humiliation easily. I knew better than to think it was over just because a decision had been made. I had lived long enough to understand that wounded pride is more dangerous than open anger. The next morning, I rode out early, before the sun fully cleared the ridge. The ground where the cabin had stood looked raw, lighter than the surrounding soil, like a scar that hadn't tanned yet. I walked it slowly, boots crunching on gravel and broken bits of concrete. I bent down and picked up a bent nail, turning it between my fingers. That nail didn't belong there. None of it ever had. I dropped it into my pocket, not as a souvenir, but as a reminder of how quietly things can be taken if you aren't paying attention. The rumors started moving faster than the creek after snow melt. Folks said the HOA was furious, that emergency meetings were being called, that lawyers were sharpening their knives. Some said I'd gone too far. Others said they wished they'd had the nerve to do the same when fences were moved and rules were changed overnight. People smiled at me again, cautiously, like they were testing the weather. I didn't blame them. Fear makes neighbors into strangers, and HOAs thrive on that fear. A week later, the officer showed up again. This time, he didn't get out of his car right away. He sat there, engine idling, watching me from behind the windshield. I was repairing a fence post, tamping dirt with the back of my shovel. I could feel his eyes on me, could feel that old pressure trying to push me into shrinking. I kept working until the post stood straight and solid. Only then did I lean on the shovel and wait. He finally stepped out, jacket off this time, sleeves rolled up like he was trying on a different version of himself. His tie was gone, collar open, but the stiffness was still there, baked into his posture. He told me the HOA was considering next steps, that there might be repercussions not covered by the ruling. His words were careful, chosen to sound official without being threats. I listened, nodding once or twice, letting him talk himself into circles. When he finished, I told him something I hadn't planned to say until the words were already out. I told him that land remembers, that every fence moved, every rule twisted, leaves a mark, even if you pretend it doesn't. I told him he could keep coming, keep posturing, but every time he did, he'd be reminding everyone else that the HOA only worked when people were afraid. He didn't like that. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked away toward the open fields like he suddenly felt exposed. After that, things shifted. Not quickly, not cleanly, but noticeably. The HOA stopped sending notices. Meetings were postponed. The officers' names started disappearing in emails and bulletins, replaced by committees and vague signatures. Power doesn't vanish, it dissolves, and watching it happen was strangely quiet. No explosions, no grand apologies, just a slow retreat. I kept working my land. I always had, but there was a difference now. Each chore felt heavier with meaning, like I was reclaiming not just acres, but time itself. I cleared brush near the creek where the cabin had cast its shadow. I planted new posts along the boundary, bright and unmistakable. I let myself remember why I'd stayed when others left, why I'd chosen soil over convenience, solitude over submission. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the mountains, I sat on the porch and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph, not relief, but a deep, steady peace. The kind that comes when you know you didn't wait for permission to be yourself. Somewhere out there, the officer was probably still arguing, still insisting the world had treated him unfairly. I didn't envy him. I had my land, my silence, and the knowledge that when the moment came, I'd answered it with my own two hands.
And if there's one thing this life has taught me, it's that suspense doesn't always come from waiting to see what happens next. Sometimes it comes from realizing that the real battle was inside you all along, and once you've won that, the rest of the noise fades, leaving only the wind, the earth, and a man standing exactly where he belongs. The quiet that followed was almost unsettling, like the pause after thunder when you're not sure if the storm has truly passed or if it's just gathering breath for another strike. I went on with my days the same way I always had. Up before dawn, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, boots on before the sun had a chance to warm the frost. But something had changed inside me. I could feel it in the way my shoulders sat straighter, in the way I no longer glanced toward the road every time a car passed. Then small things started happening, subtle things. Survey flags appeared near my boundary line one morning, bright orange, planted like little warnings. I pulled them up, one by one, slow and deliberate, stacking them neatly against the fence. The next day they were back, closer this time. I didn't pull them up right away. I left them there, a silent invitation for whoever put them there to come talk to me face to face. They didn't. Instead, a letter arrived, unsigned, filled with legal language meant to confuse more than convince. It spoke of reassessments, of shared easements, of historical usage. Words stacked on words, hoping weight alone would crush resistance. I read it once, then fed it to the wood stove and watched the edges curl and blacken. Paper burns fast when it's built on nothing solid. That night, I walked the land with a lantern, the old metal kind that hisses softly when it's lit. The aspens glowed pale in the dark, that trunks like bones under skin. I stopped where the cabin had been and set the lantern down. For a moment, I imagined it all again, the walls, the roof, the way it tried to pretend it belonged. I kicked at the dirt, scattering loose gravel, and felt a strange satisfaction knowing there was nothing left for anyone to reclaim. The next confrontation didn't come with a knock or a warning. It came as noise. Engines, multiple vehicles pulling up near the gate, headlights slicing through the early fog. I stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, watching silhouettes move around, voices murmuring with forced confidence. When they finally approached, it wasn't just the officer. They were two others, both dressed like him, well-suited, stiff, carrying folders like shields. They talked about cooperation, about compromise, about how this didn't have to get ugly. I let them talk until the words ran dry. Then I told them something simple. I told them that they were standing on my land uninvited, and they had three choices: turn around, walk back to their cars, or watch me document every step they took for the record I was building with my own eyes and memory. I didn't threaten them. I didn't raise my voice. I just stated reality, plain and immovable. They hesitated. That hesitation was everything. It told me they were used to winning by momentum, by people stepping aside to avoid discomfort. When none of them moved forward, when none of them spoke, I knew the balance had tipped. They left the way they came, engines loud, gravel spraying, dignity leaking out behind them. After that, the suspense didn't come from outside anymore. It came from inside my own chest, from waiting to see if I'd regret any of it. I thought about the easier path, the one where I'd sighed and accepted, where I'd told myself it wasn't worth the trouble. That path would have been quieter in the short term, but it would have haunted me every time I looked at that patch of ground, every time the wind moved through trees that no longer felt like mine. Weeks passed, then months. The HOA officer vanished from the picture entirely. I heard through the grapevine that he'd been reassigned, that his reputation had taken a hit he couldn't polish away. Some said he'd been pushed out quietly, others said he'd quit in a rage. The truth didn't matter to me. What mattered was the absence, the way the land finally felt unclaimed by anyone else's ambition. One afternoon, a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in years stopped by. He stood awkwardly at first, hat in hand, eyes down. Then he thanked me, said watching me stand up had reminded him of things he'd forgotten about himself, about boundaries, about saying no. He left after a short while, but his words stayed with me longer than he did. As summer leaned toward fall, I fixed the ground where the foundation had been, breaking up concrete, mixing soil, reseeding grass. It was slow work, honest work. Each shovel of dirt felt like an apology to the land, a promise that I'd noticed what had been done and taken responsibility for setting it right. When the first green shoots appeared, thin and fragile, I felt a lump rise in my throat that I didn't bother swallowing. There are nights now when I sit on the porch and listen to the dark. No engines, no footsteps, just crickets and wind and the distant call of something wild reminding me that control is an illusion people sell to each other. Out here, what matters is respect, and respect isn't voted on or enforced by paperwork. It's earned by knowing when to stand firm.
Autumn crept in quietly, the way it always does out here, one cool morning at a time, until the air carried that sharp edge that makes you breathe deeper whether you want to or not. The land looked calmer, healed on the surface, but I knew better than to believe calm meant finished. Men who lose face rarely walk away clean, and the kind of power that comes from pushing people around doesn't disappear just because it's been embarrassed. The first real sign came in the form of a fence, not mine. Overnight, someone had run a temporary wire line just inside my boundary, flimsy posts hammered in crooked as if speed mattered more than accuracy. It wasn't meant to hold cattle or mark property, it was meant to provoke. I stood there for a long time, hands on my hips, staring at it while the sun climbed higher. I could almost hear the unspoken challenge humming in the wire. I didn't cut it down right away. I followed it instead, step by step, letting my boots press into the frost-hardened dirt. It stopped just short of the creek, as if whoever placed it didn't have the nerve to go any farther. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't confidence. This was spite dressed up as persistence. By noon, the wire was gone. I rolled it up carefully, posts and all, and stacked it by the old shed. Not hidden, not destroyed, just neutralized. If they wanted it back, they'd have to come ask for it. No one did. A few days later, a drone buzzed overhead, high and obnoxious, its shadow flickering across the ground like a nervous insect. I looked up, shielding my eyes, watching it hover near the aspens. Someone was recording, mapping, measuring from a distance, too afraid to step foot on the soil themselves. I walked inside, grabbed my shotgun, and came back out, not pointing it, not threatening, just holding it where it could be seen. The drone wobbled, then retreated, disappearing over the ridge like a bad idea that finally understood it wasn't welcome. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Word spread faster after that. Not official notices, not emails, but stories. People talk, they always do. They talked about how the rancher wasn't bluffing, how pushing him only made him quieter and more dangerous in the way only patience can be. The suspense shifted again, no longer about what they would do next, but about whether they dared do anything at all. Then, late one afternoon, I saw the officer again. Not in a suit, not with a clipboard. He was standing at the edge of the road, leaning against his car, watching me from a distance like a man unsure whether he still belonged in the same story. His hair looked grayer. His posture wasn't as straight. For a moment, I considered ignoring him completely, letting him fade into the background like an old argument. Instead, I walked over. We didn't shake hands. We didn't exchange pleasantries. He told me the HOA was restructuring, that certain decisions had been reconsidered. He said my name carefully, like it might bite. There was no apology, but there was something close to it hiding behind his words. I listened, nodding once, the way you do when someone finally understands a lesson they didn't want to learn. When he finished, I told him something that surprised even me. I told him this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about limits, about what happens when you mistake silence for surrender. I told him the cabin wasn't the problem. The problem was thinking you could take without asking and expect gratitude in return. He didn't argue. He just stood there, eyes on the ground, then got in his car and drove away. That was the last time I saw him. Winter came early that year. Snow covered the land where the cabin had once stood, smoothing it into the rest of the field until you couldn't tell where the trouble had been unless you knew where to look. I stood there one morning, breath fogging the air, and felt something settle into place. Not relief, closure.
Revenge doesn't always look like fire or shouting or someone else's downfall. Sometimes it looks like persistence, like refusing to be erased, like standing on your land season after season while those who tried to move you are forced to move themselves. Now when people ask me about it, I don't embellish, I don't dramatize. I just tell them the truth, that I took back what was mine with my own hands, that I didn't wait for permission, and that when the last board fell and the dust settled, the land felt lighter, like it had been holding its breath and finally let it go. The suspense is gone now, but the lesson remains, etched deeper than any foundation ever could be. Out here, ownership isn't just about deeds and lines on a map. It's about resolve. And once you prove you have that, the world tends to step back, whether it likes it or not.
The end didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. It came the way real endings usually do, quietly, when most people aren't paying attention anymore. Winter deepened, snow piling high along the fence lines, muting the world until even anger seemed to freeze in place. I spent long days alone, mending tools, splitting firewood, listening to the wind scrape ice against the windows like fingernails. That kind of isolation gives a man time to think, and thinking is dangerous when you've been wronged. Not because it makes you reckless, but because it sharpens memory. Every slight, every smirk, every moment you were expected to step aside and be grateful for it. I knew the HOA thought the fight was over. They thought time would soften me, that age would make me tired enough to stop caring. They didn't understand that caring is the last thing an old man loses. Strength goes, speed goes, but caring hardens into something almost unbreakable. Late one afternoon, when the sky was low and heavy with snow, I found what I had been waiting for. Fresh tire tracks near the creek. Not deep, not careless, but there. Someone had crossed onto my land again, quietly this time, thinking winter would hide them. I followed the tracks on foot, moving slow, every sense alert. They led to a spot just beyond the aspens, where survey stakes had been driven deep into the frozen ground, marked with HOA colors. That's when I understood. They weren't trying to rebuild the cabin. They were trying to redraw the land itself. Something cold and steady settled in my chest. This wasn't about a structure anymore. This was about erasing me piece by piece, inch by inch, until there was nothing left worth defending. And that I could not allow. I didn't pull the stakes immediately. Instead, I did what I've always done best. I prepared. Over the next few days, I worked quietly. I reviewed my old maps, the ones drawn by hands that respected land because they depended on it. I walked every boundary, every marker, every corner my grandfather had shown me as a boy. I drove new steel posts deep into the ground, deeper than frost, deeper than convenience, exactly where the true lines belonged. Then, on the coldest morning of the year, when the air burned your lungs and the world felt brittle enough to shatter, I finished it. I removed every false marker the HOA had planted. Not angrily, not messily. I pulled them out clean, stacked them neatly, and laid them directly in front of the HOA office entrance before dawn. No note, no explanation, just evidence. By the time the sun rose, everyone knew. Phones rang, meetings were called, panic crept into voices that once sounded so sure. The officer resurfaced briefly, trying to regain control, trying to spin the story, but it was too late. Neighbors started asking questions, real questions, about boundaries, about authority, about how many other things had been quietly taken while people looked the other way. And this time, I didn't have to say a word. The HOA unraveled slowly after that, not dramatically, just enough that everyone could see the seams. Leadership changed, rules were revised, projects were halted. The officer resigned within the year, his departure framed as mutual, voluntary, dignified. I knew better. Men like that don't leave unless the ground beneath them stops holding. Spring came early.
Snow melting into the creek, the land breathing again. Grass returned where the cabin once stood, thicker than before. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, I stood there alone, hat in hand, feeling the earth soft under my boots. No shadows, no structures, no trespass. I felt tired then, not weak, earned tired, the kind that comes after a long fight you didn't ask for but finished anyway. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's precise. Sometimes it's letting someone live with the knowledge that they tried to move you and failed, that every step they took against you only drove you deeper into the ground they wanted to claim. I still ride the fence lines. I still wake before dawn. The mountains are the same. The wind still sings through the aspens, but the land feels different now, lighter, honest. And if anyone ever wonders what happened to the HOA's cabin, I don't give 'em a dramatic answer. I just tell 'em the truth. It was never theirs to begin with.